This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Gables, Garridebs, and students all came in 3-packs, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's the difference between a gamekeeper and a gatekeeper? Between a Tregennis and a Tregallis? Between a Jack in office and a Mr. Cocksure?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 175. We have much to hope from the flowers. Hello and welcome once again to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
You sure are, and boy, you are just flowering today, Burt. I can see you on video, so this is lovely.
Oh, it is wonderful.
You smell terrific.
Yeah.
What are you doing with yourself these days to cause such wonderful results?
Well, I'm a practitioner of that great old Middle Eastern practice of inhaling and exhaling, and I'm doing it vigorously.
Don't stop. Don't stop. We all love it. It's producing remarkable effects.
Yes.
Well, the remarkable effects of this show are evident if you go to ihose.co/trifles175. That will bring you to the specific show notes for this episode, which are always available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. You can write to us there if you want to leave us a comment. You can send us an email at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. And of course, check out all of our social media presence as we are I Hear of Sherlock in every single place. Well, this is the first episode of May of 2020, and they say April showers bring May flowers. What a perfect opportunity to talk about flowers in the canon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's get the elephant in the room out of the way immediately. And that is the flower that everyone is probably familiar of. That is the rose speech that Sherlock Holmes makes in the Naval Treaty. It really becomes a central part of a distraction. I mean, Holmes is in the sitting room with Percy Phelps, where Phelps is convalescing. And, you know, what's interesting about that is when you think about the setting in the Naval Treaty, when Holmes and Watson make it to I guess it's Breerbray in Woking, and they enter this living room on the ground floor, which had been set up for Percy Phelps, had been turned into a mock bedroom for him for the course of 10 weeks when he was convalescing there. We find that the surroundings are very well decorated. Flowers arranged daintily in every nook and corner is what Watson tells us. So trying to cheer Percy Phelps up, giving him a nice surrounding and, you know, a bunch of fragrant flowers. Obviously they brighten up the room. And it is in this setting that Holmes plucks the moss rose and begins his reverie, I guess we could call it. What do you make of that sick room setting there off the top of your head, Bert?
Well, I'd have to go back and reread it. You know, I don't remember the sick room setting. I mean, it's that wonderful passage where Holmes is commenting to the open air and to the people around him and to Watson about what one might learn from the flowers that's, so lovely for a variety of reasons. It appears to be out of character. It's very heartfelt. You get a lot of information about Sherlock Holmes's character that you might not have had before. And it's a lovely observation. And of course, the Naval Treaty, I think, is also, isn't it in the Naval Treaty that there's also the reference to lighthouses, beacons of the future. And so here, if that's the case, here you have, you learn a lot about Holmes's view of the world and his philosophy, let's say, from this commentary.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great observation. And I think you are correct about beacons of the future. I'll do a quick search here to make sure your memory is rendering itself properly. I believe it was beacons. Yeah, it was a naval treaty. So they're on their way out to Woking, and they understand that that these board schools hold a lot more in them. And again, you think about seeds of the future. That's almost botanical in nature as well. Very clearly, Holmes was very philosophical and very thoughtful about things at this point. And let's see if we can capture the tone of what a lovely thing a rose is as Holmes launches into this. He was talking with Phelps and Miss Harrison there, and questioned Phelps about the commissionaire. And Phelps said, "Oh, I've heard he was part of the Coldstream Guards." And Holmes says, "Thank you. I have no doubt I can get details from Forbes. The authorities are excellent at amassing facts, though they do not always use them to advantage." What a lovely thing a rose is. Right? So right there, he's cutting off from where he can get his information from. He can verify what Phelps told him, and then suddenly is almost like a dog seeing a squirrel. Watson tells us he walked past the couch to the open window and held up the drooping stalk of a moss rose, looking down at the dainty blend of crimson and green. It was a new phase of his character to me, for I had never before seen him show any keen interest in natural objects.
Well, and then, Holmes says there's nothing in which deduction is so necessary as in religion. But this whole thing, I mean, before we even get there, you're absolutely right. He's in the middle of another conversation. So they're talking about a commissionaire, and the commissionaire's an old soldier, and what regiment, or maybe the Coldstream Guards. Oh, thanks. I've no doubt I can get the details, What a lovely thing a rose is. I mean, he's completely sidetracked by his own observation. And then has this extraordinary commentary. There's nothing in which deduction is so necessary as in religion. Oh, it can be built up as an exact science by the reasoner, but our highest assurance of the goodness of providence seems to me to rest in the flowers. All the other things, our powers, our desires, our food, are all really necessary for our existence in the first instance. But this rose, this is an extra. Its smell and its color are an embellishment of life, not a condition of it. It's only goodness which gives extras. And so I say, again, we have much to hope from the flowers. And of course, the people in the room are just astonished here. And some of them are a little disappointed. Percy Phelps would like him to say, "Oh, I know exactly what the Naval Treaty is." It's over here. But here he is, musing about a flower. It's extraordinary. And then the next thing that happens, is that Miss Harrison says, "Do you see any prospect of solving this mystery, Mr. Holmes?" And he's completely someplace else. He says, "Oh, the mystery. Oh. Well, it would be absurd to deny that it's very abstruse and complicated, but I will look into it, and I'll let you know any points which might strike me." And they can't get him out of there fast enough to go back to London and to get to work.
Right. So do you think that was a ploy? Do you think he was trying to maybe perhaps lull Joseph Harrison and the other members of the party in the room into a false sense of doubt about his abilities?
Oh, maybe. That's a lovely theory. That the observation on the rose was sort of complete misdirection. Well, we know he does that in the past. We recently talked about an episode where to prevent some fact from being discussed, he had a neurotic fit and fell to the ground and so on. So that's certainly possible. I never thought of that.
Yeah.
That's clever.
There's no indication from Watson that this reverie was a distraction, but it could have been very well disguised from Watson and everyone else. Now, Watson said he had never known Holmes to show any interest in flowers before. I go back to A Study in Scarlet and that famous list that Watson puts together, Sherlock Holmes' limits. And number 5 was botany. and he assessed Holmes' skill in botany as variable and adds well up in belladonna, opium, and poisons generally, knows nothing of practical gardening.
Well, in a way, this is consistent with that, because what Watson says is, and it's a lovely little observation, and it's before Holmes's this discussion, commentary about the flower. It's before that happens. He just says, what a lovely thing a rose is. And Watson says, it describes what Holmes is doing, looking down at the dainty blend of crimson and green. And Watson says it was a new phase of his character to me, for I'd never before seen him show any keen interest in natural objects, which I guess is a euphemism for nature. So he doesn't have a keen interest in nature and doesn't have any knowledge of gardening.
Very true. Very true. Well, that's probably the most famous instance of a flower making its presence known in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Let's turn to other instances where we can come across flowers and flowery-like substances right after this quick message from our sponsor. Spring is here, and that means the spring issue of the Baker Street Journal is beginning to arrive all around the world. In this issue, it's the usual lineup of great scholarship, like a re-examination of the Reichenbach Fall by Derek Belanger, and Just His Type, an analysis of the Decoupé warning in The Hound of the Baskervilles by Jessica Schilling. And in this issue, a very special word from Wiggins. That's right, the Baker Street Irregulars have a new leader in Michael Keene. And in his inaugural message to all readers of the Baker Street Journal, he pens a wonderful, warm, and welcoming note. We hope that you will warmly welcome the Baker Street Journal to your mailbox and your collection by subscribing at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. And we're back talking about flowers in the Canon. We talked famously about that moss rose, but there's a whole story that's named after a particular kind of flower. And that is, can you think of it, Bert?
Yes, that's the chrysanthemum of identity. That's one of my favorites.
Oh my gosh. We're launching into shades of canonical couplets over here. No, Bert, this would be, I'm thinking of Wisteria Lodge.
Oh, good grief, wrong again.
Wisteria Lodge. That's all right. I'll give you a pass this time. No, but interestingly, when we go through Wisteria Lodge, there is no mention of wisteria around the lodge. John Scott Eccles, in his approach to the house, and even Holmes and Watson, when they arrive later to investigate it with Inspector Baines, note nothing of wisteria being on the grounds or around the house. However, there's an interesting passage here in the beginning of the story, or toward the beginning of the story, where John Scott Eccles was at Baker Street, and he said, "I'm sure it must look very bad, Mr. Holmes, and I'm not aware that in my whole life such a thing has ever happened before, but will tell you the whole queer business, and when I have done so, you will admit, I'm sure, that there has been enough to excuse me." And Watson says, but his narrative was nipped in the bud. There was a bustle outside, and Mrs. Hudson opened the door to usher in two robust and official-looking individuals. So, nipped in the bud, a nice turn of phrase there that has botanical roots, has flowery roots, if you will. I just had to correct somebody the other day in a text exchange who said she was going to nip something in the butt. And I said, please, don't be nipping at people's butts. It's nipped in the bud. It's a matter of pruning and trimming to ensure a sightly appearance later on. That's where that comes from. And I'm sure you knew that already.
Oh, yeah, of course. Well, yes, absolutely. Well, I can't nip anything in the bud because I don't have a bull pup any longer.
That is the extent of flowery language in Wisteria Lodge. However, Wisteria do make a brief appearance once again in the adventure of the Creeping Man. And they're spelled a little differently in the Creeping Man. It's instead of being spelled Wisteria, it's spelled Wistaria.
Really? Oh, that's interesting.
In the Creeping Man. And if we refer to Doubleday, it can be seen on page 1076. Okay, we can but try. Excellent, Watson, a compound of the busy bee and Excelsior. We can but try, the motto of the firm. A friendly native will surely guide us. Such a one on the back of a smart hansom swept us past a row of ancient colleges and finally turning into a tree-lined drive, pulled up at the door of a charming house, girt round with lawns and covered with purple wisteria. That was Professor Presbury's place at Camford. So in addition to the appearance of wisteria, crocuses tend to spring up, if you'll allow that. This is a spring flower, of course, and we recall most famously in The Adventure of the Speckled Band, when Grimsby Roylott makes an appearance and Holmes kind of coolly responds to his presence. He says, "It is a little cold for the time of year," said Holmes. "What has she been saying to you?" screamed the old man furiously. "But I have heard that the crocuses promise well," continued my companion imperturbably. So just this kind of casual conversation about the weather, the flowers, etc., as a juxtaposition to Grimsby Roylott's ire.
Well, now, you see, if Roylott had been reading the Strand magazine, he would have replied, "What do you mean by that, sir? I have it on good authority. Your knowledge of gardening is quite primitive, if not completely non-existent."
I like that. Know your foe.
That's right.
Similarly, crocuses figure in The Adventure of the Empty House, which I believe we are told takes place in April of 1894. They looked at the surroundings of the Adair household in Park Lane, and Watson tells us that a minute examination of the circumstances served only to make the case more complex. In the first place, no reason could be given why the young man should have fastened the door upon the inside. There was a possibility that the murderer had done this and had afterwards escaped by the window. But the drop was at least 20 feet, however, and a bed of crocuses in full bloom lay beneath. Neither the flowers nor the earth showed any sign of having been disturbed. So, wonderful example of using flowers and their relative health to rule out anyone trampling through there for the case of making their escape.
Yeah. Well, it's a great example. And, of course, that puts paid to the idea that Holmes paid no attention to nature because he was keenly observant, well, about certain natural objects like rain and mud and footprints and stones and things that you might find among the grasses that shouldn't be there, little bits of evidence.
And that's probably more along the lines of the practical but limited geologist in Holmes. He could use the surroundings for his own sake.
Yeah.
Similarly, it was at Ridlingthorpe Manor and the Dancing Men were a flower bed. Once again, gave up clues. A flower bed, Watson tells us, extended up to the study window, and we all broke into an exclamation as we approached it. The flowers were trampled down, and the soft soil was imprinted all over with footmarks. Large masculine feet they were, with peculiarly long, sharp toes. Holmes hunted about among the grass and leaves like a retriever after a wounded bird. And with a cry of satisfaction, he bent forward and picked up a little brazen cylinder.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's lovely. Well, the odd thing about flowers and Sherlock Holmes, I don't suppose it really is odd, is that for the Victorians, this was an era in which obviously people were not very free in their expression of their own feelings. And in fact, the whole process of courting and making yourself agreeable to a member of the opposite sex was, for many people, quite a subject of ritual. And the flowers played a part in that. There was certain symbolism attached to flowers. And we see symbolism in lots of areas in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, in orange pips and other things, but never in flowers. And you see this in a lot of the paintings too, where you'll find a white rosebud in a portrait painting of a young child, sort of as a symbol of innocence, or I don't remember what the rest of them were. I think gardenias were supposed to be symbols of passionate love, and of course roses have always had a connotation of romance. But there's a whole system like that, and it never pops up, I don't think, in the cases of Sherlock Holmes.
No, that's a good point. I mean, there's a lot of flowery plantings or just natural outcropping of flowers that Watson mentions by way of setting. We see gorse along the meadow in The Solitary Cyclist, and again in The Priory School, when Holmes and Watson were trying to follow the trail of the German master Heidegger. We see mare's tail and orchid in The Hound of the Baskervilles as part of the natural surroundings of the Grimpen Mire. And later, in The Hound, while we're on it, it was not mentioned for any kind of symbolism, but just as a scent. The Stapletons went down to Devonshire, whether they were soon followed by Sir Henry and you. One word as to how I stood myself at the time. This is Holmes talking about how he came to some conclusions. This is in the final chapter. It may possibly recur to your memory that when I examined the paper upon which the printed words were fastened, I made a close inspection for the watermark. In doing so, I also held it within a few inches of my eyes, and was conscious of a faint smell of the scent known as white jessamine. There are 75 perfumes, which it is very necessary that a criminal expert should be able to distinguish from each other, and the cases, more than once within my own expertise, depended upon their prompt recognition. The scent suggested the presence of a lady. So white jessamine, which may be also in the same line as jasmine. So that was an interesting mention there in The Hound. But beyond that, in terms of setting and symbolism, we don't really see much in the way of specific flowers in the canon. But I do want to call attention to two instances of simply the scent of flowers in the air and how Watson used it to describe kind of a pleasant place and again, the setting that he wishes to convey in the telling. One is in, I know, one of your beloved stories, The Devil's Foot. Watson describes the Tregennis house. He said it was a large and bright dwelling, rather a villa than a cottage, with a considerable garden, which was already in that Cornish air, well filled with spring flowers. Right, so that kind of bracing. I know when I think of Cornish air, it's along the sea coast. There's this notion of, kind of a bit of tempestuousness, the wind, and Holmes and Watson enjoying the outdoors for a bit. I thought that was one nice example of using flowers to create a setting. And then the other was in Black Peter, I believe, where Watson and Holmes were, this is July now, Watson and Holmes are cooped up in that cabin where the blue bottles are buzzing, and they need a break from this horrible environment. And Holmes says, let us walk in these beautiful woods, Watson, and give a few hours to the birds and the flowers. So kind of getting away from it all. No sense that they were talking about the birds and the bees, but...
That's lovely. It's just another wonderful human dimension to Sherlock Holmes, and the idea that he and Watson would go for a little stroll, is a lovely dimension to their friendship. But boy, there's an argument to be made that with these behavioral swings of Holmes, of course, they're all colliding because we're pulling them out and just sort of assembling them one by one like playing cards. But, you can make a case that Watson got to the point sometimes that he just didn't know what was going to come out next.
Very true.
Birds and the flowers? Oh, of course. Yes. That's exactly what I was thinking.
That's why we came here, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
Oh. Well, yeah, we should just conclude with this one minor mention in The Adventure of the Second Stain as Trelawney Hope. Mr. Trelawney Hope is going through his dispatch box. He said, here are the papers you see. Letter from Lord Morrow, a report from Sir Charles Hardy, memorandum from Belgrade, note on the Russo-German grain taxes, letter from Madrid, note from Lord Flowers. Good heavens! Lord Flowers. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
What a lovely thing. Roses. There is nothing in which deduction is so necessary as in religion. It can be built up as an exact science by the reasoner. Our highest assurance of the goodness of Providence seems to me to rest in the flowers. It is only goodness which gives extras. And so I say again, we have much to hope